are about to begin, please do take your seats. Your Excellencies, heads of state and government, honorable ministers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. My name is Ann Kiguta. I am a Nairobi-based journalist, show host, and global moderator, and I will be your MC this morning. I'd like to welcome you very much to this Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, climate change side event. Despite the major global events that have been taking place over the last 6 months, tackling climate change remains the biggest challenge that we are facing globally. We do not have any time to waste in building the resilience of the vulnerable countries and also in taking action to reduce emissions in line with the global goal to keep 1.5 alive. And this theme is particularly important in the context of our Commonwealth, with many small island and vulnerable nations already struggling with climate change and its impacts. Today's event will have 3 parts. In the first part, we will have a high-level call to action, and then 2 panel discussions, one on keeping the 1.5 goal alive, and the second looking at innovative access to climate finance. But to start, here now is a video that hears from the very real people who are experiencing the climate change impacts. Please take a look at your screen.
Kids like me are worried about our future. My name is Lana. I'm from Rwanda, and I'm going to tell you why. I'm only 10 years old, but I already know what climate change looks like. Floods and landslides are hurting people. Drought and rising temperatures are causing fires and heat waves. So many animals are going extinct every day. It's pretty scary. That's why kids all across the Commonwealth know that we have to stop climate change. We might be a bit scared, but we're not afraid of a challenge. We can fix it by working together and looking after Mother Nature. We can switch to cool electric buses and trucks and charge them with clean energy. We can switch for biomass energy for cooking and adopt clean energy as an alternative. We can protect all the amazing plants and animals that call Earth home. But we need your support. Yes, you. We need you to invest in the future, not the past. We need more forests, greener cities, healthier rivers, and more sustainable agriculture, and a circular economy. We need to keep fossil fuel in the ground and say no to polluting plastics. If you do this, you'll create green jobs for young people all across the Commonwealth. You'll clean the air we breathe and make the world a safer place. We want Commonwealth leaders to keep people safe from the impacts of climate change. We want the Commonwealth business community to reduce emissions and invest in green technology. We want women and young people to have a greater say in defining our common future. We want action today. I love my planet and I want to protect it. Will you join me?
Will you join him? Yes. Well, in this first part of the event, we will hear now from 3 senior speakers about the scale of the challenge that we are facing and a call to action on the role the Commonwealth can take. We will have a video message from the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson and remarks from our guest of honor, the Right Honorable Dr. Edouard Ngirente, Prime Minister of Rwanda. But first, Let us now hear from the UN General Assembly President, His Excellency Abdullah Shahid, about the role he feels that the Commonwealth can play in the fight against climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome His Excellency.
Heads of State and Government, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It was an honor to be invited to this year's Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. This is a first for a President of the General Assembly. I thank the government of Rwanda and the government of the United Kingdom, together with COP26 Presidency, for organizing this event. And I commend your efforts to promote reflection on the outcomes of COP26 and to make progress on climate commitments that we have made. This includes meeting our goals relevant to Glasgow Climate Pact to reduce coal usage to keep the 1.5 target alive. These efforts must be part of both our long-term endeavors to reduce carbon emissions and to generate momentum as we look towards COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. The CHOGM's theme this year is not just timely, it is urgent. While we continue to grapple with the impacts and rebuilding efforts of the COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis continues unabated. We urgently need solutions if we are to meet our targets and keep our promises, not only to each other, but to future generations as well. My dear friends, today we will discuss a range of critical issues, including the urgent need for countries to take immediate climate action. And we will discuss how we can propel and leverage our creative capacity and ongoing innovation to meet our climate targets. We must keep in mind that vulnerable countries such as LDCs, LLDCs, and the SIDS have been forced to divert many of their resources towards recovery from the pandemic. That is why we also need to discuss strategies to increase climate financing so that those countries can simultaneously continue their efforts to recover from the pandemic and to become more climate resilient. These are challenging tasks, but I remain optimistic. My presidency is one of hope. Although our world is rife with inaction, inequality, and injustice, we must remain hopeful. As I have continued to reiterate, we have the capacity to meet all our climate commitments. We have the ingenuity, we have the resources, and we have the technology. We can transition to renewable energy sources, we can reduce emissions, and we can preserve our Mother Earth and its ecosystems. All that is required is political will. The reason I remain hopeful is that despite the challenges and the cynicism of years past, I have seen progress in my lifetime. The 1.5 target used to be only a concern of small island developing states, but the world has since joined forces around this goal. It is now a core target for many member states. This, to me, is progress. COP26 in Glasgow galvanized momentum in key areas that needed collective work, upholding the 1.5 target, communicating ambitious nationally determined contributions, doubling climate finance towards adaptation and resilience, and completing the Paris rulebook. To reiterate, we must continue to build on these goals as we move towards COP27 and beyond. Alongside our commitment to keep the 1.5 alive and efforts to mitigate climate change, the international community launched the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program, introducing the global goal of adaptation. I commend the progress in outlining the scope, institutional arrangements, objectives, and activities of the work program to be concluded by COP28 for the first global stocktake. Building on what we learned and committed at the COP26, and keeping in mind the reality of climate change, that we have witnessed in the last year alone, I encourage member states to submit ambitious NDCs at COP28. I'm hopeful that member states will reaffirm their shared commitment to combat climate change and promote the development of sustainable innovation and solutions. And I thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, a short video message from the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson, who only arrives today and so could not make it here in person. Please take a look at your screen.
I'm absolutely thrilled to address this event because it's 7 months since we gathered in Glasgow for the biggest summit the United Kingdom has ever hosted. And we stared at the peril that we've created by quilting the earth in a suffocating blanket of CO2, and we promised to halt this planetary doomsday machine while we still can. And it was members of the Commonwealth family from the Caribbean, from the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, who spoke so movingly with the greatest authority because they live only a few feet above the waves. And they can see how the oceans might rise to engulf them. I will never forget the warning of Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados. She told us that allowing global temperatures to rise by 2 degrees would be a death sentence for her country and for many others. If we're going to avoid such a catastrophe, we must keep our promises and fulfill the Glasgow Climate Pact. That means revising and strengthening our nationally determined contributions by September, keeping alive the Paris goal of holding the increase in global temperatures below 1.5 degrees. We in the developed world have got to keep our promises and also double the adaptation finance funding to $40 billion by 2025. While any country that has not already done so needs to create a long-term strategy to get to net zero. And many, many Commonwealth members are setting the standard. By taking advantage of ever cheaper renewable energy, advancing towards net zero, we can protect ourselves from volatile fossil fuel prices, we can create millions of jobs, and we can transform our economies with a green industrial revolution. We can protect our planet and help our people to thrive, provided that we keep the Glasgow promises and hold firm now to the bold course on which we are set.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for that message. Finally now, we will hear from our guest of honor, Right Honorable Dr. Edward Ngirente, the Prime Minister of Rwanda. Our guest of honor led the Rwandan delegation at COP26 last year, and we are pleased to hear today his reflections on the importance of collective climate action as we gather here in his very beautiful country. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome the Prime Minister of Rwanda, Honorable Dr. Edward Ngirente.
Excellencies, Head of State and the Government, Honorable Ministers from Commonwealth Member States, UN General Assembly President, COP26 President, distinguished guests, a very good morning. Close to 8 months after COP26, we meet again in Kigali to discuss progress on the Glasgow Climate Pact ahead of the COP27. Rwanda is very happy to host you all, and we hope you are having a wonderful stay in Kigali. I would like to start by recognizing the government of the United Kingdom and the COP26 Presidency for partnering with Rwanda in co-hosting this important event. There is a lot of Commonwealth member states can do together to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. Many Commonwealth members, particularly developing states, are especially vulnerable to warming world. The larger economies are major emitters and have much work ahead to reduce emissions. This puts the Commonwealth in a unique position to work together and deliver a common future that is clean, green, and climate resilient. Distinguished guests, last year, the world delivered the Glasgow Climate Pact and numerous multilateral agreements on forests and financing. But with emissions continuing to rise, it is clear that we have to do more. I have watched the video. The young man was challenging us in terms of taking action. He called on business leaders and government leaders to invest in technologies of tomorrow. And this is our task as leaders. We cannot let down a generation that is looking to us for answers. In Rwanda, the average temperature has already increased by almost 1.5 degrees Celsius. The upper limit, scientists keep reminding us of. The resulting extreme weather events, including floods and landslides, are taking hundreds of lives every year. The economic costs are rising quickly. This is why Rwanda has put the environment and climate change at the heart of our Vision 2050. We're working to be a carbon neutral by middle of the century. Achieving these goals require significant investments. Bilateral and traditional climate finance and technology sharing will continue to play an important role in this progress. However, it is clearly not enough. This is why today's focus on innovative climate finance is so pertinent. I am pleased to note that there will be a discussion on how vulnerable Commonwealth nations can benefit from mechanisms like the carbon market. The Kigali Principles on carbon finance can support this effort, and we are keen to advance this agreement with member states. Thank you for being with us today. The Commonwealth continues to lead on climate actions. We look forward to a strong call for climate actions in the final communique on the Commonwealth Head of Government meeting. I wish you fruitful discussions, and thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Prime Minister. May I request you not to take your seat, sir? Kindly return and join me here off stage. And I would also like to invite to stand alongside with you other speakers and panelists for today's session from our high table, heads of state and government. Please, would you join the Prime Minister off stage here? Photographers, if you would be at the ready. We will have a very brief photo session. The first will be off stage and the second on stage. Leaders sat at our high tables. Our Excellencies, the President of Botswana, the Prime Minister of Jamaica, the Prime Minister of Canada, the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, and all our distinguished guests and panelists. May I also invite the Prime Minister of St. Lucia, if he is with us, the Prime Minister of Lesotho, the Minister of Water, Forest, the Sea and Environment for Gabon. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would indulge us for just a quick moment or two for a quick photo session. moment. Thank you very much for just one more quick photo opportunity. Please hold, photographers. We're going to have one or two more guests join us. Thank you very, very much. Please do take your seats. Thank you very much. Thank you. And so now it's time for our first all-important panel discussion. This panel is titled Keeping 1.5 Alive, the Glasgow Climate Pact. We'll be hearing from senior actors here who are charged with leading the fight against climate change in their countries and in the Commonwealth. The discussion will look at how countries are strengthening their international commitments to reduce emissions, the urgency that is required on mitigation action, and the need for continued focus on adaptation as we get global emissions in check. We will ask a question of each of our participants, depending on time, and I am aware we're running about 5 or so minutes late. I will request all our panelists to keep it very brief so that we can hear their thoughts and reflections. And then if we do have another minute or two, I may get an intervention from the floor. So now I'll welcome onto the stage our panelists for this very first session. And what an incredible panel we do have this morning for you. The Right Honorable Gaston Brown, Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, please join me on stage. The Right Honorable Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada. His Excellency Dr. Mokwetsi Masisi, President of Botswana. Honorable Dr. Jean-Darc Mujawamaria, Rwandan Minister of Environment. A round of applause for them. Please do take your seats. Welcome.
Thank you.
But first, let us hear from the COP President, Right Honorable Alok Sharma, who will set the scene for our discussion by providing an overview of the achievements in Glasgow and the importance of keeping that 1.5-degree goal alive. Please welcome the COP President, Alok Sharma.
Well, ladies and gentlemen and friends, it's a pleasure to be here today alongside all of our friends from the Commonwealth, including, of course, our great host, Rwanda. You've already heard from two prime ministers this morning, both of whom spoke with great force about the climate challenges and indeed the opportunities that we have ahead of us. And I'm very pleased to be kicking off this panel to focus specifically on delivering what we committed to in Glasgow. As you've heard, it's now over 7 months since COP26, where under the UK stewardship, almost 200 countries agreed the historic Glasgow Climate Pact. And it was an agreement that was forged in the understanding that it is in all our interests to tackle climate change. We know it too well. Climate change does not recognize borders. And so this pact, which we agreed, forges a path to a clean global future. And it's based on commitments made in that pact, and indeed outside of the negotiating rooms as well, is that we were able to say with some credibility that we had kept alive the prospect of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. But as we know, the world has changed markedly in the months since COP26. We meet against the backdrop of multiple global crises, much precipitated by Vladimir Putin's illegal, brutal, and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. But even as leaders deal with the immediate challenges facing us, all the evidence, including the latest findings of the IPCC reports, make clear that the chronic threat of climate change is getting worse. It's not going away. And the pulse of 1.5 degrees remains weak. And friends, it's only going to be strengthened if countries and companies deliver on their commitments. And that has been the key focus of our presidency this year. It's been about pushing forward on implementation, implementation, implementation. Now, we've made some progress. We've seen some nationally determined contributions, new ones coming through. And of course, I very much welcome the recent announcement from our Australian friends as well. We also have 51 long-term strategies which have been submitted to the UNFCCC. Over 2 billion people are now covered by adaptation plans, and work is being done to scale up finance and to make sure that it can reach the most climate vulnerable countries as well. Now, all of this work is welcome, but the reality is that we need to pick up the pace. And that means that every country must respond to the call to revisit and strengthen their NDC. And they've got to do this, not at some vague time in the future, but this year, in 2022. And the major emitters must lead from the front, particularly those countries with little or no increase in ambition since Paris. Countries must also submit long-term strategies aligned with net zero, and this needs to be done before the UNFCCC's synthesis report deadline of September the 23rd. I'm particularly proud to serve as co-chair of the NDC partnership alongside Minister Samuda of Jamaica. And as you know, this allows countries to request the support they need to develop and implement their NDCs and long-term strategies. And so I'm really pleased to announce that the UK is doubling its funding to the NDC partnership to £10 million. And I would encourage countries to use that resource. We also need developed countries to deliver on finance and support developing nations' ambitions, and that means further progress on delivering the $100 billion that has already been promised, including through an update to the $100 billion climate finance report, which we published ahead of COP26 last year. And that progress update needs to address the commitment to double adaptation finance to $40 billion by 2025. And I'm very grateful to the Canadian and the German governments for agreeing to prepare that update report. More widely, I urge all climate finance providers, including the multilateral development banks, to set out clear and ambitious adaptation finance targets by COP27. And indeed, for all climate finance providers to align with the principles and recommendations agreed as part of the Task Force on Access to Climate Finance, particularly on the Task Force's 5 pioneer country trials, which are ongoing in Bangladesh, in Fiji, in Jamaica, in Rwanda, and Uganda. We also need to respond to the calls for reform from developing countries and the small island development states to ensure that the most climate vulnerable countries receive the climate finance that they need, and faster, and in alignment with their own plans and priorities. And so I'm very pleased that the next panel after this one is going to focus on that critical issue. We also need to see progress on just energy transition partnerships, on the global goal on adaptation and the Santiago network, and also in critical sectors and on clean technologies. Friends, the Commonwealth should play an important role in driving this climate finance work, because the Commonwealth comprises major emitters and also some of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world. So it is clearly in our collective interest to work together to take action and tackle the challenges we face together. Our collective voice can be a powerful force. And frankly, we have no other choice. As Prime Minister Johnson said in the video earlier, it's those members of the Commonwealth family from the Caribbean, the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean that speak with particular authority on this issue. Because for them, this is now becoming a matter of survival, of life or death. So it is time to honor the promises that we made in Glasgow and turn commitments into action. And it's time to show the world the confidence that COP26 inspired in the multilateral system was not misplaced. And it is time to make sure that we arrive in Egypt at COP27 in November, able to say that although the world has changed, our resolve to tackle climate change has not. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sir, please join us on stage. Thank you. So we begin now with some of the most affected countries by climate change. And I would like to begin with you, Sir Honorable Gaston Brown, the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda. Between the years 2015 and 2020, the combined cost incurred from tropical storms and hurricanes in your country was $232 million US. On average, hurricanes account for about 8.4% of the annual loss in GDP for Antigua and Barbuda. So, Your Excellency, you have obviously been very passionate, a passionate advocate on climate action. What would you want to see now from all countries collectively this year? And how do you think we can convince those who are perhaps slightly more reluctant to get on board and deliver now?
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. The amount you stated of $230 million, that's an understatement. In fact, in 2017, our sister island, Barbuda, was decimated by Hurricane Irma. And the loss for that single event was $222 million US. So climate change for us is real. It is the most significant existential threat facing our planet. And it requires an all-of-society approach to resolve this issue, recognizing that we live on a common planet, there's no planet B, and that fundamentally we are all one and the same human beings with the common mitochondrial DNA from a common grandmother about 200,000 years ago. It means, therefore, that we must be empathetic to each other, we must collaborate with each other to deal with this threat, this existential threat facing all peoples globally. In fact, we would like to see greater commitment from the industrialized countries in particular, and we expect them to scale up their funding. In fact, many of those countries, they're gaming the system. They speak about climate change, they speak glibly about commitments, but in many instances have actually failed to satisfy the commitments. And we know that in order to address the issue of climate change effectively, it requires funding. So funding needs to be scaled up, and in addition, accessibility to funding is very important, and funding for climate change should also be inclusive. We find that some of the most vulnerable countries globally have been excluded from much needed funding, utilizing artificial impediments such as the per capita income. In fact, currently we're doing some work at the United Nations to develop a multi-dimensional vulnerability index, which we hope will be utilized in the future to ensure greater inclusivity, because at the end of the day, as I said, we're all in this thing together, and it requires an all-of-society approach, and we cannot allow the most vulnerable and the least resilient among us to be left behind. And I want to make the point here, too, in terms of loss and damage, which is one of the areas that has been neglected in the Glasgow Climate Pact, that is a fundamental issue for small states globally. And industrialized countries do not see this as giving a gift to small states. In fact, it is the industrialized countries, primarily the G20 countries, that have created the problem. And we're the ones who are suffering from the profligate use of fossil fuels. And clearly, these G20 countries, they are literally committing a tort on all of humanity. And the polluter must pay. So they should not see our request for additional funding as coming cap in hand. They not only have a moral obligation based on our common humanity, but they have a legal obligation to help us to mitigate and to adapt against the effects of climate change. So I come here to ask for new funding mechanisms, fit-for-purpose mechanisms, not to be utilizing institutions like the IMF that will come up with these funding mechanisms that are not fit for purpose. Most recent is the RST, in which in order to access the funds, you have to be part of an official IMF program, and that is just totally unhelpful because of the stigma associated with IMF programs. So we would like to see greater responsiveness, more bespoke funding mechanisms in order to assist the more vulnerable countries within the Caribbean, the Indian and Pacific Oceans.
Thank you, Prime Minister.
you.
Couldn't be clearer than that. Polluters must pay.
Thank you.
You don't want to applaud that? Thank you. Let me move now to you, the Prime Minister of Canada, Right Honorable Justin Trudeau. Canada is setting an example. Through Canada's 2021 revised NDC, Canada is committed to a 2030 target of 40 to 45% below 2005 levels. Would you share with us Canada's priority climate change actions, perhaps in supporting the reduction of emissions to keep the 1.5 goal alive?
Thank you very much, Anne. And what a pleasure it is to be here with so many friends talking about this existential crisis that we all face as a planet. There is no question that we are all being impacted by climate change, and as we have and will continue to engage with small island developing states, and particularly vulnerable ones, there is no country in the world not affected by climate change. Canada, as you know, northern country, you might seem global warming as not as much of a problem for Canada. On the contrary, we're warming faster than just about anyone else in the world, and our Arctic is warming 3 times or 4 times faster than that. It's causing heat waves and droughts and terrible floods that are devastating communities across our country and echoing around the world. Canada is a country that for many years over the past decades hesitated a little bit on leading in the fight against climate change. We have the 3rd largest proven oil reserves in the world. So there's lots of reasons for us to say, oh no, let's just stick with fossil fuels a little longer. And certainly it's a significant part of our economy. But about 7 years ago, Canada made a very clear decision that we were going to move forward, that we were going to bring in mechanisms and show leadership, not just at home but around the world, that meant it was time. It was time to tackle climate change with everything we have. And that's what we've been doing, whether it's through showing up at Paris with some ambitious targets, or whether it's at Glasgow moving towards even stronger targets and a commitment to net zero by 2050. We've also stepped up on international financing. We've doubled our commitments up to $5.3 billion in financing for development. But at the same time, as Alok mentioned, we're working closely with Germany to make sure that we reach that $100 billion a year funding level for climate financing around the world. Because this is a challenge that comes at the same time as so many other challenges, whether it's war that's destabilizing fuel prices and food crises caused by Russia's illegal and illegitimate attacks on Ukraine, whether it's the challenges of disrupted supply chains and continuing consequences of a global pandemic. As our friend Mia Motley loved to quote Bob Marley, there is so much trouble in the world right now. And this is a moment for all of us to be pulling together. One of the things Canada is pushing on very, very hard is a way not just of having governments lead and citizens take action, but making sure that the private sector takes action as well. Yes, we know there are many strong initiatives around financing and investments in new infrastructure and resilient infrastructure that we're working on in terms of bringing in the private sector. But one of the clearest things you can do to send strong signals to the private sector is put a price on pollution. Make sure that they know that if they don't upgrade their factories, change their ways of doing things, include the externalities of pollution in their business models, we don't get there. We don't keep 1.5 alive. So with a strong and increasing price signal that you can send to investors to know that yes, they have to justify the upgrade in equipment, the new filters, the new technologies to invest in, We're not going to reach there. We're not going to harness the power of innovation and entrepreneurship that needs to drive this. That's why Canada moved forward with a broad-based price on pollution that it is among the strongest in the world. And we did it, and those of you who are worried as democracies, can we really bring in a price on pollution at a time where people are worried about price at the pump? Not only did we bring it in, but we then won 2 elections on it. And the way we did, the way we did it was very straightforward. We made sure that the average family is better off because we return them directly money from the carbon pricing so that they're better off on average. Now, the wealthy families with large indoor swimming pools, no, they're not better off, but average families are. And that power of telling people, okay, if you're getting $600 back and you make changes to better insulate your windows or buy a more efficient car, you'll keep more of that money. And that's a good thing, and that's a signal. But the big thing is the indication on private sector and on businesses that they need to keep innovating if they're going to stay competitive. But it only really works if the world starts to move towards carbon pricing, because right now, Canadian companies are at a competitive disadvantage, and it will get increasingly so. So we need to move towards a world where 60% of global emissions are covered under strong prices on pollution. We just had Chile join a few months ago with that leadership. I know a number of people are putting prices on pollution. We need to step up that ambition, because that's how we harness that private sector dollars, the private sector innovation that is going to make sure that we keep 1.5 alive. Lots more to say, but I'm glad to pass it back to you, Anne.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. Thank you. Let me come to you now, Your Excellency, the President of Botswana. President Masisi, sir, in November this year, Africa is going to host COP27 in Egypt, and we are very proud that we will be doing so. What is Botswana's contribution, would you say, to keeping the 1.5 degrees goal alive? And if you would also let us know the steps that your country is taking to tackle the climate emergency and respond to the Glasgow Climate Pact.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Moderator, and I too am pleased to be here and want to thank the Rwandese for a typical Rwandese hospitable welcome. Heads of government, distinguished leaders, it's my pleasure to indicate to you that Botswana completely submits to what we agreed to in Glasgow. Botswana, relative to its size, has made very strong commitments to mitigate and reduce the impact of climate change, and not only commit itself to the target set, but has taken active steps in the review of its legislation, the review of its policy. We have developed a new climate policy to advance and reward those who take steps, both in government and industry, parastatal households, to reduce emissions. Of particular interest is that we have developed a new integrated resource plan. And following Glasgow, immediately following Glasgow, because we had completed it, I had then instructed that it be revised quite soon, because it was clear that we needed to take further steps to reduce emissions. And in the revision, we are committed to increasing the contribution of solar energy to our energy mix. And it makes sense because Botswana sits very comfortably in a place on the planet where solar is able to contribute enormously. We are also finishing off our study on wind energy, and we hope to finish it by the end of this year, and we will factor that into our energy mix. We are also resolute in advancing the advocacy for the need for all nation states, developing and developed, to play their part, proportionate to their contributions that negatively affect Mother Earth. And Africa should never be excluded from this. For while we have these forests, they are threatened also by the absence of peace in some of those, and those who promote the absence of peace in the production of the technologies that cause conflict and war, which ravages forests, enhance the ability of those who strip the forests of their ability to support us. We also want to promote advocacy globally to help mitigate these by reminding all of us of our conscious responsibility to realizing that, you know, at the heart of mitigations for climate change is a real consideration that ought to be had of the significance of multilateralism. If there's any issue, if there's any threat, global threat that affects everybody, that compels and justifies the reason for having a multilateral order, it is climate change. And so we call on all nation states, big and small, to play their part as we do in Botswana. I could speak of the specific figures. It may not interest you much because Botswana is relatively small, but in its smallness, we have contributed more relative to those who need to contribute more. And so we will not stop at this, and we're glad to be a part of the global family.
Small but mighty, I would say.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now to our hosts, the Honorable Dr. Jean-D'Arc Mujawa Maria, who is the Minister of Environment for the government of Rwanda. Minister, Rwanda is making Africa proud. Rwanda was the first country in Africa to come up not only with a revised NDC, but also with a detailed NDC implementation framework. So what would you say then are the climate targets of Rwanda, and which would you say are then the key climate actions that Rwanda is prioritizing to keep the 1.5 goal alive?
Thank you, Anne, for the question. And I would like to echo our Prime Minister by welcoming our distinguished guests to Rwanda. We are very much honored to have you in this important gathering discussing about climate. I want to share a story that illustrates why Rwanda has put the environment and climate change in everything that we do. On the eve of Christmas Day of 2019, Rwanda experienced a terrible rainstorm. The intensity and the amount of the rain that fell left roads flooded, bridges destroyed, houses demolished, and crops washed away. And just 2 weeks earlier, the government had made the difficult decision to relocate people living in the wetlands, especially here in the capital city, Kigali. At the time, there was understandable concern about the impact of those who have been living in those high risky zones. But what happened on Christmas, the Christmas day of 2019, was a sober reminder that the devastation could have been much worse if the government had failed to take decisive action. Many hundreds of lives were saved because of that difficult but wise decision. This is the kind of decision making we need. As leaders, we have to make hard but necessary choices to keep the 1.5 degrees goal alive. These are the experiences that led Rwanda to take climate change seriously and do something about it. If we remember the young boy, Lionel, from the video we watched earlier, he was standing in Nyandungu wetland. That wetland used to be occupied by human activities. A degraded ecosystem was the song of the day, and that wetland was restored and is now full of life. And today, the wetland is also protecting people from heavy flooding while offering green space and blissful air to the people of Kigali. So these decisions would not have been possible without strong political will, strong nation leadership, as well as clear policy goals. Rwanda's ambitions, NDC, commit the country to reduce emission by 38%, by 38% by 2030 compared to business as usual. Indeed, through the overarching Vision 2050, we envision Rwanda to be a carbon neutral country by the middle of the century. So those are the goals we have set for ourselves. But how are we going to get there? Here are a few examples. We are investing heavily in conservation, climate smart and resource efficient agriculture. We are decarbonizing our energy system by phasing out the use of fossil fuel and investing in renewable. We are improving waste management to reduce emissions, turning waste into energy, and investing in the circular economy with a state-of-the-art e-waste recycling facility so that in Rwanda, no waste should be wasted. Biodiversity is also critical. That is why Rwanda has covered 30% of its land by forest, and we are not done yet. We still continue to reforest our country. Rwanda is also positioning itself as a green finance and green growth hub. Our NDC requires $11 billion by 2030. And so we need to be creative about how to raise that money. That is why we established the Rwanda Green Fund, which has already mobilized more than $250 million and has created around 200,000 green jobs. We have also established the Kigali International Financial Center, which will attract sustainable finance to the country. We know that the best investment we can make is in nature. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the only projects that did not stop operating were nature restoration initiatives. So at the core of our effort is commitment to the well-being of everyone who calls Rwanda home. So we want our children, like Lionel we have seen, to grow up in a clean, green, sustainable environment and safe environment. They deserve nothing less. I thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the context that you gave, Minister. Tough choices now, but it's for the benefit of the people, and it saves lives. Thank you so much for your views. I know we are perhaps just a minute or two out of time, but Would you allow me, Honorable Sharma, to just get some reaction from you? You've heard what member states are doing. You would forgive me to be very proud. You've heard of what African states are doing in their contribution. If you'd respond, please, sir.
Well, thank you very much for that. Look, I think what we've heard is inspirational action that is going on in Africa, and I salute the work that is going on here in Rwanda, in Botswana, indeed across Africa as well. And we have to remember, friends, that Africa is responsible for less than 3% of global emissions, less than 3%. And yet, it's full of countries that are at the front line of climate change. And that's why I'm pleased that actually we have COP27 happening in Africa, and it will be an opportunity to put the issues that are particularly important on adaptation at the forefront. I also just want to respond to what Prime Minister Brown said about finance. He's right. We need to make sure that we have the mechanisms that is actually getting support to all countries which are facing the devastation from climate change. I was in Barbuda last year, and I stood on that island and I looked around, and you're right, sir, it is still, parts of it, devastated. And what the local communities told me there is that unless the biggest emitters take action, what they're fearful of are these climate events getting more frequent and more ferocious. And finally, I just want to respond to Prime Minister Trudeau's point on carbon pricing. He's absolutely right. I mean, this issue of carbon leakage is something that every country needs to consider. Many are considering it. And what we really need for this to work effectively is a global solution. And I just want to add with this point that the Prime Minister raised on, or the President raised on the multilateral system. Look, we know the multilateral system is very strained right now, but if there is one issue on which we should absolutely continue to try and work together as a global community, it is climate action. It is an existential threat, and that's why we need to make sure that our response is a joined-up global response. Thank you.
Madam Moderator, before you wrap up, if I could intervene quickly, I want to commend Prime Minister Trudeau and his government for the carbon pricing in which they are taxing these polluting companies. And I think that the G20 in particular should follow the lead of Canada. I'm also of the view that during this period of crisis, that fossil fuel companies should not be benefiting from extraordinary profits, and that the G20 countries should come together and introduce a windfall tax on these companies, the proceeds of which could be utilized to fund climate change. Thank you.
Much. Thank you.
I want to associate myself with what my colleague, the Prime Minister of Antigua, said, and just to let you know the impact of hurricanes on our island. You can get up one morning and find the complete island, half of the island, completely gone in 7 or 8 hours. And that is the reality that I don't think larger countries understand what it means to be living in 268 square miles, 170 square miles, and get up one morning and there is nothing there. But these are only the large events about. There are a number of small events that cause just the amount of hardship and damage to the people of the country. When there's excessive rain, there are floods, there are landslides. So climate change is real, and anything we can do to subvert it would be welcome, particularly in our small islands. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Perhaps we could get a microphone to Minister Lee White, the Minister of Water, Forestry and Environment from Gabon.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this great panel. If I might ask a question, slightly provocative question to my sister Jeanne d'Arc. As you speak, I feel that Rwanda is becoming the Costa Rica of Africa. You're growing your forests back. And I wonder, do you feel that the international community is giving you enough support? You know, we have this process called Red Plus, and the plus is all about restoring and growing back forests. So presumably you're receiving millions of dollars of Red Plus payments for this reforesting mission that you have. So I wonder if you could comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. I like that you said it's a provocative question, because we have been discussing this with my colleague, the Minister of Gabon. The solution to our problems should start from our home. We have to start deforestation project from our own budget, so that partners will see the enthusiasm we are having by rehabilitating our landscape and come and chip in. We cannot wait the outsiders to come and build our countries. We have to start from mean and show what we are capable of, and people will come and support. We are getting international support, but we are getting more of our inner support. I thank you.
Marvelously handled, ma'am. Wonderful. Thank you very much for that question. Perhaps just one more intervention, if we would. The Prime Minister of Lesotho, if you're here, Dr. Moketsi Majoro. Yes. Yes.
You go, sir. Well, thank you very much. This issue is difficult in so many ways. We are targeting or keeping 1.5 alive, and the message is that even with that, we are already struggling. It took more than 100 years to just go up 1 degree with many unpredictable occurrences in our countries. And if we don't change course, we are likely to end up at 2.5, 2.7 degrees, and nobody can predict. I think going forward to just another 0.5, we are likely to see an exponential growth in unpredictable climate events. So even as we struggle just to keep 1.5 degrees alive, it's not very encouraging that we may even achieve that. But I suspect that the additional 0.5 degrees is going to present the globe with much more complications than we are today estimating. Indeed, we are now looking at wars across the globe, and we think that the reconfiguration of energy supplies in Europe means that we are going to derail a little bit in our attempts. Just on the small point of having to adapt, our small country, Lesotho, produces nearly nothing in greenhouse gases, but we are on the forefront of suffering. It's either extreme droughts. When you jump from droughts, it's rain. We all like rain. But in the last 2 years, Lesotho has experienced 50-year floods, 100-year floods. How do we cope? Yes, we have small windows of resources here and there, but they pale to nothing in terms of what we have to deal with. We have to cope now with our inability to grow enough food for our people, either it's droughts, or when it rains too much. So I'm encouraged by this gathering. The challenges we are facing are immense, and it's going to have to take us talking over and over and over on this particular thing. And in fact, I think, why don't we just turn the Commonwealth, the UN, the AU, the EU, everybody just talks about climate change from morning to evening. I thank you.
I think I agree with you. Thank you. Please, a round of applause to all our wonderful panelists. Thank you very much, Your Excellencies, Heads of State. Thank you very much. Please, you may take your seats. Thank you. So, as you've heard, as we've already known, the challenge is considerable, but I believe it's clear that we have leaders who are committed, and when we leave this room, I hope we will leave with a renewed sense of commitment and of urgency to address the challenges that we face together. It's now time for our second panel to discuss innovative access to climate financing. To moderate this panel, I'm very pleased to invite my very able co-moderator, Jahan Chaudhry, the cluster lead for environment and climate at IFAD and the United Nations, to take to the stage, sir, if you would. Let's welcome him with a round of applause, and he will shortly introduce his panel.
Thank you very much. Great to be here. I am from Bangladesh. I live in the US, and my work takes me to all over the world. But my heart is always in Rwanda because of three reasons. Everything that I know about environment and climate, I learned from Rwanda. I had changed my mindset from focusing on exclusively double-digit growth at any cost to making sure that climate is mainstreamed across the planning, budgeting, and public investment procedure of government. And third, this is where I met my wife. So personally, it's an important place for me. And it's always great to be back to my home. Now, in the previous session, we heard the importance of keeping 1.5 degree alive. Now, we can keep 1.5 degree alive through a ventilator, but that's not what we want. We want 1.5 that is healthy, something that we can experience, we can see it, and we can feel it. And one of the key instruments to make sure that we have a healthy 1.5 is climate finance. And that is going to be the focus of our discussion in this session. We have an incredible panel. I would first like to invite on stage the Most Honorable Andrew Michael Holness, the Prime Minister of Jamaica, Your Excellency. We have Yannick Glemerc. He's the Executive Director of the Green Climate Fund. We have Juliet Kabera, the Director General of Rwanda Environment and Management Authority. And to ensure that we are synchronizing our messages with the private sector, we also have a representation from the private sector. We welcome Barbara Ann Burnett. She is the founder and CIO of Windcrest Capital. Now, about climate finance. My first question goes to our Most Honorable Andrew Michael Holness, the Prime Minister of Jamaica. We have heard from our COP26 President today a very refreshing message that NDC partnership will be receiving an additional £10 million. And you are also the co-chair of NDC Partnership. And under your leadership, you have just recently published the NDC Partnership Finance Strategy. Prime Minister, tell us a bit more about what this strategy is going to be doing to unlock climate finance. How is this working in Jamaica? And how do you think initiatives such as NDC Partnership, working together with other organizations like GCF, can accelerate climate finance, not only just the quantity, but also the quality?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Excellent, excellent question. And I want to join you in acknowledging the new contributions from our friends in the United Kingdom. I think that's good leadership and a good example. The issue of climate is such an existential one. And all the speakers before have highlighted the real practical issues that all countries are facing, large countries, small countries, developed countries, developing countries. And I think we're all sold on that. But the challenge is to move from the aspiration to do good to actually get it done, the practical things. And that's where the ambition hits a snag, hits a roadblock. I'm very happy to be co-chairing the NDC Partnership Initiative because it takes on a very practical approach to the solution. You may divide the problem into two parts. One would be the commitment to provide the financing itself. Many of us in this room would have heard the commitments being made over and over again to reach $100 billion. Sometimes we're not quite sure when is the timeline. It's been revised so many times. And there can be a sense of frustration, particularly from developed countries that have the wherewithal and the resources to do it, but have not done it, as was pointed out by my friend, Prime Minister Gaston Brown. But then there is the other side of the frustration, that where funds are available, countries do not have the wherewithal to actually utilize the funds in meaningful ways, in ways that are going to be transformational. Because what you wouldn't want to happen is for countries to get the funds and then do projects that have no impact on us attaining, maintaining our commitment to being below 1.5. So there has to be a very strategic, almost granular and customized approach to solving the problem. I want to associate myself with the comments of Prime Minister Trudeau as well, that there is the moral element of the issue, but there is also the economistic element of the issue. And we're not going to escape economics in the solution. And therefore, a price to the problem is important. And what I like about the thrust of the NDC partnership is that it is not just focusing on the public financing element, which is usually very limited in its scope, but it is also seeking to mobilize the private sector. And it is very important in the conversation about how we treat with climate change that we seek to match our moral values with our market values. How do we get the markets to make economic decisions that are aligned with our moral ambitions? And that is not always very easy, but it can work when there is a very cohesive strategy that you can place on the table for investors to look at and say, here is the return. And so in Jamaica's case, we're minuscule in the contribution to the problem. But we have decided to reduce our emissions by 28.5%.
And this will mean a focus on transforming our energy sector, transforming our infrastructure in terms of roads and revetment protections, in terms of replanting our mangroves and forests, and treating with agriculture and bringing in our young people into agriculture to make agriculture resilient in our country. So that is going to take a whole investment plan to change this. Now, it's one thing for an academician to write the plan, which I'm certain that the capacity exists in all our countries to do that. But there are some elements of the plan which will require significant technical support in terms of understanding the financial opportunities that are available. And there is also the political dynamic that countries have to maneuver. How do you get a utility company, for example, to agree to change their massive investments that are already sunk in fossil fuel generation to migrate to renewables? There's an entire dynamics. So the political economy, we have to pay attention to that. And so the partnership has mobilized technical support and practical support, and it has created a community of nations where we can, and institutions that helps in the sharing of knowledge and best practices. And I think that is going very well in ensuring that nations are actually producing NDCs that are practical and that are, which we would like to describe them as having a pipeline of projects that are bankable and transformational.
Thank you, Prime Minister. So what you are trying to do in your capacity as the co-chair together with the UK is essentially synchronize the dancing between the public sector and the private sector, the connection between the moral value and the market value, and of course, connecting the project originators with the project financiers with a very clear business case. Now, talking about business case, I want to dive into the adaptation part of the climate change discussion. As we have heard in the first panel, adaptation plans are not just adaptation plans, these are survival plans for many of the vulnerable countries. So Yannick, if you could tell us a bit more about how GCF is positioning itself to accelerate the access to financing to the vulnerable countries. So that's the first part of my question. And the second part, how are you incentivizing the private sector from pledges to actual execution?
Thank you very much, Jan, for this very interesting questions. The United Nations Environment Programme estimates that the adaptation financing need will be between 150 billion to $300 billion by 2030. So even if we honor the commitment made last year at COP26 to double the adaptation finance to $40 billion, we will still be speaking about 1/4 to 1/5 to 1/8 of the financing needs that will be required by 2030. And a number of members of the first panel mentioned this. Is the private sector to be the solution? Right now, most unlikely. The private sector did account for less than 2% of the total financing for adaptation in 2017-2018, and ended up accounting for less than 2% of the adaptation financing for 2019 and 2020. So it's clear that if we want to address the financing gap for adaptation, we need the public sector and the private sector to come up with new forms of cooperation. GCF mandate, the Green Climate Fund mandate, is to foster a paradigm shift toward low-emission, climate-resilient development in developing countries. We are mandated to allocate 50% of our resources to mitigation, 50% to adaptation. And right now, we allocate about 2/3 of this 50% for adaptation to the most vulnerable states, African states, SEEDs, and LDCs. But we account for about 3% of the total climate finance under the UNFCCC. So for us, allocating 50% of our resources to adaptation will be of some help, but not a dramatic help unless we try to use this money in a very highly catalytic manner to shift much, much, much larger financial flows. And that's our ambition. So what kind of approach are we taking? The first one, I would like to take back your terminology. We are trying to make a business case for private sector investment in adaptation. And actually, Honorable Prime Minister Andrew Holness has already mentioned it. What do we need to make a business case to begin with? First, we need a long-term national strategy in terms of adaptation. Where is the country going? The private sector lacks certainty. They love certainty. The second thing is that we need to translate this strategy into a series of bankable projects. It would take a full seminar to discuss the terminology bankable projects, so let's not go there. But the first thing that we need to do is that we need to translate this long-term strategy into bankable projects. The second thing is that we need to empower the private sector to basically incorporate climate and financial risk into the design of their investment. And right now, it's often very difficult for them to do that because they do not have the climate information to do that. And that's the reason why GCF has invested about $500 million in early warning and climate information system, so that not only we save life, we save assets in case of extreme weather events, but we enable every single private sector operator to incorporate climate risk, climate physical and transition risk into their investment decision-making, into their new asset design. And because I'm with Honorable Prime Minister Andrew Holness, I will take one example from Jamaica. We are working with Jamaica on a new methodology to incorporate climate risk into the design of infrastructure. So basically, we are working about repricing assets. Second thing, in addition to the business case, the second thing is that we need to foster innovation in terms of adaptation. Adaptation is extremely context-based. One adaptation solution in one country will actually lead to maladaptation in another country. So it's extremely important to enable every single climate entrepreneurs in every single country to come with locally suitable adaptation solution. And for example, we found that by using traditional technologies in Egypt, we could build living shoreline to protect the Nile Delta for a fraction of the cost of traditional sea dikes. And living shoreline is beautiful because you do not have to bet on the level of sea level rise because it's living. You can keep creating it. So we need to invest in innovation. We need to finance adaptation innovators. And GCF has developed several early growth financing mechanisms for that. And for example, in Eastern Europe, in Eastern Africa, we are financing the Acumen Agricultural Resilience Fund that provide equity finance, debt finance to SMEs that develop locally appropriate climate adaptation solution. Third thing is that once we have a new option, a new solution, how do we bring it to scale? Why in OECD, repricing asset will be enough. In most developing countries, not only you have to reprice asset, but you have also to de-risk asset to make sure that you reduce the risk for the first investors that come with a new solution. And for that, there are plenty of different solutions, such as, for example, you can use first loss equity, you can use a first loss guarantee, you can use insurances. One example, we have financed $500 million, $600 million private equity fund for coral reef, for countries to invest in sustainable fisheries, sustainable mariculture, sustainable forest scalp production. And when we started telling investors, let's try to invest in coral reef protection, because it's between 500 million to 1 billion people whose livelihood depend on it. Institutional investors were basically looking at us saying, what, investing in coral reef? And so to reassure them, we decided to provide $150 million of first lost equity. The first to lose our money, it's us. Now, if this project is successful, we get back our money. But much, much more important, we will have demonstrated that investing in coral reef protection is a valid investment for institutional investors, but also for you and I. When we go to see our banker, we can ask for 5% of our saving to go to coral reef protection. We will have created a new asset class, and there you shift money at the level of billions and billions of dollars. The fourth and last thing for me, it's extremely important to engineer access to long-term affordable finance, and notably access to domestic and international capital market. And we are working with several countries on basically different credit enhancement instruments to enable countries to float climate resilient bonds, green bonds. And here again, because I'm with Prime Minister Holness, we have worked with Jamaica on the establishment of the first regional exchange for green bonds for the Caribbean. This is extraordinarily important because at the end of the day, when you speak about trillions, you speak about capital markets. And I believe the green bond, sustainability-linked bond, and all other type of social bond were about $1 trillion last year. So gigantic amount of money. Africa accounted for 0.077% of this issuance, and this is something we have to change, and we have to change it now.
Excellent. So we need business case that has to be locally grounded. We are talking about homegrown solutions. We need risk-reducing instruments to be deployed. We need innovative financial instruments, and we need access to the capital market, both nationally as well as internationally. Thank you so much, Yannick. My third panel member, Juliet Kabera, she is from REMA, the Rwanda Environment and Management Authority. This is the home where the Rwanda Green Fund was born. Working with the Rwandan government, I know how ambitious the government is, and you're embarking on a new ambition, and that is the Kigali Principles on carbon finance. Our Excellency, the Prime Minister, was mentioning about this today. And one thing that I have always noticed that a lot of the emphasis is actually based on inward-looking solutions. Build it and they will come. Could you tell us a bit more about the Kigali Principles? What are these principles, and how do you plan to pilot test these principles in Rwanda, in Commonwealth countries, before rolling them out in other countries? Over to you, Juliet.
Thank you, Jahan, for that very interesting question. I have a disclaimer, my voice is not the best this morning. I'm pretty sure climate change has a role in this, but I'll do my best. Yeah, so the distinguished panelists in the previous panel really reminded us of the urgent need to maintain or to keep alive the 1.5 degree centigrade. And this to us means that we need to step up our mitigation, ambitions, actions, and that further means that we need to have more access to the resources that we need to actually implement those ambitions. I think it's more than just having the aspirational goals, plans, as you rightly put it. We want to see real tangible projects, actions that will contribute to the reduction of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So that implies that we need to have innovative mechanisms
to bring on board those resources. We are grateful. We have the GCFs, we have our governments, multilateral financing institutions. But what else can we look out for to actually feed the gap that we already are seeing? Luckily enough, many, if not all, of the Commonwealth member states have developed their NDCs. These are fully costed, but they are not fully resourced. So we are looking for those other potentials or mechanisms that can be explored to resource the NDCs the soonest possible. So amongst those mechanisms is carbon finance, and this is actually coming up. One of my colleagues was telling me that the currency nowadays is carbon, and I think His Excellency, the Prime Minister of Canada, at least took us through what Canada is doing, and it's really vivid that carbon can be a currency if we got more organized, if we build our capacity at a national level, human resource, to make sure that we tap into this. This means that first of all, the statistics that we are seeing, the carbon credits are increasing. Only the first quarter of this year, we saw 1.4 billion USD of carbon credits that were sold only in the first quarter of 2022. And the research shows that this is going to grow even exponentially. So Kigali Principles, therefore, based on all that information that is available, and also aware that corporations, countries are developing zero carbon targets for the year 2050. And so this opens us up to even more potentials from even the private sector, if not especially, mainly from the private sector. So aware that we don't have the necessary technical expertise in putting this together, aware that we don't have even an agreed upon methodology, at least in the Commonwealth member states, Rwanda is suggesting that we could come together in form of a task force to actually develop the methodologies, to understand who is going to do what, who wants to join, how many are those emission reductions can we generate, because when we go to the market with a big quantity of emission reductions, then we are going to have a better negotiating potential. So how do we bring together all the emission reductions, not only from Rwanda or from the next Commonwealth member state, but us together as a group of countries? So we agree that we are going to have this in a more more organized, bundled together, probably in a basket, and then approach the sources of the carbon finance together to be able to fund our climate actions. So I'm inviting everyone to join this task force. This is going to be working towards the carbon market for all Commonwealth nations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juliet. So we are talking about the task force methodology design, a technical assistance facility to support the countries. My last panel member, we want climate finance, but we are facing a strong headwind given the current geopolitical situation, the inflation leading to food crisis, as well as the overall capacity of the countries to access climate finance. How do you think we can use the carbon market as a trampoline to excite the private sector and inject more money coming to project financing?
Well, thank you for the question. I have to start with a disclaimer. I'm neither a climate scientist nor a politician. I'm a practitioner. And I enjoy thinking about how to scale sustainable solutions. And when I look at the carbon markets, I think they work well for companies with net zero targets who are buying credits from project developers who are charging 20 to 50% commission on those projects. They've got it sorted. It does not work for countries. And this is what Minister Lee was alluding to. And so I think the answer is scale And that's a really unique opportunity for the Commonwealth. We have 52 countries that can work together, and we can have a common currency, and that currency can be carbon. And we can use that currency to fund our energy transition whilst preserving and restoring our natural resources and creating local jobs. So that is the potential, but what are the bottlenecks? Why is that not happening? And when I think about the carbon markets, I want countries to get the most money possible and pay the lowest commission. So how do we solve for that? Number one, I would incentivize countries to work together by sharing the commission with them. So the more credits you list, the more commission you make. Why is that important? Because of what Minister Lee said. Most of the credits from these countries are going to be natural resource based, and they come with strings attached. And whilst more money for conservation is absolutely needed, some money for the energy transition, for green wealth funds, to fund solar panels, to fund windmills, which in my mind equals energy independence, is critical. So now, if everyone's incentivized to work together, we have scale. The second thing I would do is I would apply the auction model, because historically auctions get the highest price. And this is not happening. So when you have transparency, market pricing, and scale, now you have the opportunity to digitize. And when you digitize, things can trade globally, they can settle 24/7, and that is a currency. And that is the transition currency that we all need to be focused on. So another bottleneck, and our panelists alluded to it, was funding. And part of the reason I think more private capital hasn't come into the carbon markets is I'm not sure they're using the right structure. In my opinion, the answer is a closed-end listed vehicle because it's permanent capital. These carbon credits issue credits for 25 years. A 10-year private equity fund does not work. And no one's done this yet. But I have a meeting with the London Stock Exchange about it next week, and I'm really excited about that potential. So now, if we have scale and we have profitable projects, countries can put forward projects and get them funded quickly. It's no use going around asking for donations. That's not effective. And if it's a good return and sustainable investment, the money is there. This is alpha. This is what every pension plan in the world is looking for. So the third thing is we need the project developers. And today, the project developers will fly in, spend some time in your country, and leave. I would much rather see the project development courses put online, and that we are showing local people how to develop these projects so that we create local employment benefits. Now we have a sustainable ecosystem. Surprise, surprise, the answer always tends to be an ecosystem. So those are my thoughts on how to make the market more scalable, transparent, and a currency. And the thing that gets me most excited is there are enough leaders in this room today to make that vision a reality by the next CHOGM. And I think that would be a wonderful legacy for all of us today.
Enough leaders in this room today to make it happen. I would not dare to summarize the rich discussion, but let me go back to what we heard from the boy here in Rwanda. He was talking about a bus. I think our destination is very clear. It's 1.5 degree. It's a healthy 1.5 degree. And we need that bus to reach our destination, but it has to be powered through the renewable energy. We need the driver, and we have the public sector setting the course, and we want the private sector to drive that bus. We want the communities to be empowered to track the progress of this bus. And very importantly, we need the passengers to afford the journey. Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you so much for the panel members for being here.
Thank you very much to our second panel, Your Excellency and distinguished guests. And now, to close our meeting, I would like to invite Her Excellency Amina J. Mohammed, the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations and the Chair of the United Nations Sustainable Development Group, to provide the closing address. Welcome, ma'am. A round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I almost rewrote my speech as I was listening to the last panel. But Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, many colleagues and friends in the room, it's great to be here and to have the opportunity of giving some closing reflections. We're at the midpoint between COP26 and COP27. The Glasgow Climate Pact, the main outcome of COP26, laid bare huge gaps on mitigation, on finance, and on adaptation. But it also gave us the actions and the impetus that was needed to close these gaps through just transitions at a scale, and as we heard, with a sense of urgency. Sadly, today, we're seeing, even with the best efforts, and there are many efforts around, almost 6 months after Glasgow, we're still off track. Today, we've heard that there is political will behind the Glasgow Climate Pact and renewed commitment to deliver on the Paris Agreement. But the intent is still not translating into the actions that we need. We heard $130 trillion in dollars in commitments in Glasgow, and that was music to many ears. It's still yet to translate. I often joke about it, but it's a serious joke. Just $1 trillion would do. Just to give us a sense that this is real, that we're not making speeches, that we're actually putting concrete behind it and the flows that are needed to go to governments. Last year's global emissions were at the highest level ever. The nationally determined contributions submitted last year would result in an increase in global emissions of 14% by 2030. And science tells us for us to be on a credible pathway to keep alive that 1.5 degree in Celsius, global emissions would need to decline by 45% below 2010 levels, and that by 2030. So the battle to keep the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement alive and prevent the worst impacts of climate will still be won or lost in this decade. And with each passing day of inaction, the pulse of 1.5 just gets weaker and weaker. At Glasgow, all countries agreed to revise and strengthen their NDCs. G20 nations account for 80% of global emissions. Their leadership is needed more than ever to bend the global emissions curve towards 1.5. And I'm really pleased to see my colleague and my friend, Right Honourable Alok Sharma here, whose leadership gave us ambition and the impetus at COP26, but it also gave us hope for COP27. On finance, a $100 billion commitment made over a decade ago remains unmet, and the trillions needed to ensure a low-carbon, climate-resilient future yet to be mobilized. Developing countries to continue to face extraordinary barriers in accessing finance they need, particularly to protect themselves from the worst impacts of climate change, which are happening now. Of course, this is all happening against a devastating backdrop, according to IPCC. At 1.1 degrees of warming, people living in Central and South America, most of Africa, small island developing states in South Asia are 15 times more likely to die from a climate impact. 10 days ago, I was in Central Asia and saw physically what was happening to the glaciers there. Lands of opportunity being turned into lands of less than that for many millions of people. The recent climate discussions in Bonn didn't reflect the reality of this emergency. And so, in the 6 months to Sharm el-Sheikh, the window to demonstrate that countries are taking serious steps as agreed in Glasgow, not yet closed. So what can we do? We still have hope to make that work. It does mean countries bringing forward new and enhanced NDCs, underpinned by concrete policies, especially from those that have not yet done so, and those major emitters that are not yet on a 1.5 degree pathway. We need to go a step further, and that is why the Secretary General has called for coalitions of support around key emerging economies to accelerate the transition away from coal. And there are many countries in this room that are supporting that from the G7. It means donors providing clarity on when and how the $100 billion promise will be met. And let's be clear, this is not money that is going to actually deliver on climate action needed for 1.5 degrees, but it is the handshake from those who have profited from coal, who have profited from industrializing their nations, to those who have yet to develop. It's the handshake, and we can't even get that done. And if we don't get that done, then the trust deficit that we need in rooms like this to continue the negotiation begins to be challenged. We've heard today that we will be providing a road for mapping of the doubling of adaptation finance. But I think from the panelists, risk-reducing instruments that we've spoken to that we need. I would say green bonds, and we produced the first national one in my country, Nigeria, they need to be on steroids. We cannot keep talking about the levels that we see now, and when we talk about the increases, they may be huge increases, but they're still so far from the needs in closing that gap. New asset classes, so really thinking about that. If that can release the billions that we're talking about, then let's get on with it. But we also need to understand better and to develop the carbon credit markets. That we've heard today, it is possible, so we need to be doing that. It also means that our multilateral development banks playing part in mobilizing the trillions that are needed for private finance. We hear about it, but can we get this into countries? Can we actually mobilize the resources? And we did hear that we need concrete solutions from reforming rules around eligibility and the burdens and the criteria that many countries face. Let me say that, with the best of my lived experience and exposure, as a Minister of Environment, you needed a PhD to get through some of these processes. This is just not on. It's almost as though setting you up for failure. You can see the resources, but you can't touch them because the pathway to those resources, the capacity that you need to pay for in order to get to those resources is huge. And so we do need to see local solutions. The Kigali Principles are really important. But what our last speaker said, we need to find the local capacity. There is educated population. There is a group of young people who can provide those pipelines of projects. They can develop them. We don't need to import that from the outside. What we need is a partnership and the resources to make those real. It also means that we need concrete steps on two words that I think I have not yet understood why they are so heavy when they come to an audience that we speak in Bonn, for instance. Concrete steps to address loss and damage. What is the problem with these two words? It's a reality for many people. It has to be addressed. At what point in time will we actually move away from not really wanting to see that on the agenda? This came up in COP, and it is going to COP27, and I applaud the leadership again of Alok Sharma of really making it possible that we can continue to talk about this. We have to keep focused on protecting the most vulnerable. Every president, every leader sees what it is that they have are challenged by in their countries today. Triple crises, climate, the war in Ukraine, COVID, and we're still recovering. And we know there will be another pandemic around the corner somewhere. A lack of being able to use the climate agenda to get forward really does not bode well, not just for the climate impacts, but for instability, because this young cohort of people that need to believe in a future are slowly tiring and losing hope. And when that happens, we are all in trouble. It doesn't matter whether you're living in the north or you're living in the south. It will cross borders. Young people will no longer wait. Out of every 3 persons in the world are not covered by an early warning system, again, persons predominantly in LDCs and SIDS, the SG has put a proposal there. Let's try to do this in 5 years. We should do it in sooner time. The cost of it is minimal. It's a drop in the ocean compared to what happens when we have these more intense climate events. Multilateralism, unfortunately, is under strain. Yet, in the Commonwealth, we have the potential to lead the way. This is a huge opportunity of a diverse community of countries spanning many regions of the world, languages, religions, cultures. But as Secretary General Patricia Scotland had said, you have many frameworks that are the same, so it allows us to be a really powerful force for making the changes that are needed. And I've seen that in many of the governance issues that we've addressed, particularly with tax. And we all know that it is our domestic resources, enhanced and more inclusive, that will get us to the climate end. So I would say here, the inputs, the important things is that we have the solutions. We just need to fuel them. I didn't see the young man with the bus, but right now what we need is that bus needs to be a Ferrari, because we need speed. And we need the quality. We don't want less than what it is that other people feel they deserve. We want the best for those developing countries that need them. My appeal to Commonwealth leaders today is that We are inundated by crises, but let's look for the silver lining in all those clouds. Let's not step back from our commitments and revert to the lowest common denominator. We have to close the gaps on mitigation, on adaptation, on finance and loss and damage. But we must also engage in the just transitions. And it's not just an energy transition. It's a food transformation as we are feeling the impact now. It's a digital one. These are investments that come together to make a whole. That's what sustainable development is about. So thank you for allowing me to share a few reflections. I'm very hopeful, and we're not giving up. And in this room, I know that we have incredible leaders that will help take us forward. So thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. And that, heads of state and government, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the conclusion of this event. I want to thank each and every one of you very much for being here, and a special thank you to both our panels. Let me make this one request of you, that we would mostly remain in our seats in order to allow our heads of state and government and our high-level speakers to leave the room. And a final request to you is that you would get out your phones and follow the QR code that will be provided on your screen very shortly. There you go. And learn more about the Kigali Principles. My name is Anne Kiguta. It's